That Pareto distribution, which is what that is, that seems to characterize everything that's associated with individual variability in creative production. And it's a funny law. So here's the sorts of phenomena that seem to be distributed in that Pareto manner. Size of cities. So a small number of cities have most of the people. Height of plants in the jungle. Mass of stars. A small number of stars in the galaxy have most of the mass. If you're in any sports domain, number of goals scored is Pareto distributed as well. Number of championships won. The distribution of money, as I already pointed out, is Pareto distributed, and so is the distribution of productivity in industrial settings. And so it isn't exactly obvious why that is, but I think it's because success works like this. You could think, well, here's failure, that's the failure path, and here's the success path, so that's linear, right? Going uphill in a linear way, but it doesn't look like it's like that. It looks like you go up like this, right? So it's 0, 0, 0 acceleration. It's hard to get past 0, but once you do, you could accelerate rapidly. Failure is the opposite way. You fail a little bit, you fail a little bit, you fail a lot, right? And I think the reason is that you get feedback loops developing. So, if you're successful at one thing, then more opportunities come your way, and so do more people. And more people open more doors for you, and more opportunities manifest themselves. And it's so like, once good things start to happen, each good thing that happens seems to increase the probability that another good thing will happen on the creativity or the productivity or the capital accumulation front. And on the negative front, the same thing happens. Every time something bad happens to you, then it increases the probability that something additionally bad will happen to you. And so you get this strange phenomenon that seems to be associated with the Pareto distribution. And that follows a law called Price's law from someone named Derek de Solla Price, who was studying scientific productivity in the early 1960s. And what he showed was that a vanishingly small proportion of the scientists operating in a given scientific domain produced half the output. And so what you see, and what's happening is that to do really well at a given productive task, which would also include generating money as a proxy for creative productivity, is that you have to be, a bunch of things have to go your way simultaneously. So maybe you have to be really, really smart, you have to be really, really lucky, you have to be really healthy, you have to be really energetic, you have to be really conscientious, you have to be in the right time at the right place. And maybe you also have to have the right social network, right? Like, so it's a lot of things, and each of those are small probability. Each of those are small probabilities, and then if you multiply the small probabilities together, you get an extraordinarily tiny probability. And you have to have all those things functioning before you're going to end out on the extreme end of the productivity distribution. But if you do end up there, then you produce almost all of everything. So it's a tiny number of people that produce almost all of everything. That's Price's law. And technically it is, and I mentioned this to you before, it's the square root law. The square root of the number of people in a productive domain produce half the output. Right? So if you have 10 employees, 3 of them produce half the output. If you have 100, 10 of them produce half the output. If you have 10,000, 100 of them produce half the productive output. And so what that also means is that because there's massive variability in performance, you don't have to shift your ability to predict performance very, very, very much up towards being better at it to gain substantially on the positive side, because there's so much difference in productivity. And that actually happens to be also a function of the complexity of the job. If the job is simple, which means this job has 10 rules, maybe that's a janitorial job, let's say. It takes a little while to learn it, but once you've learned it, you basically do the same thing all the time. There's not a lot of performance variability in those jobs, and most of that would be eaten up by conscientiousness, and also to some degree by neuroticism, because the people who are higher neuroticism would be more likely to miss work. But general cognitive ability, for example, is not a good predictor at all. It'll predict how fast you learn the tasks initially, but not how well you perform the tasks. But if the tasks you're doing are shifting constantly, so your responsibilities change, or you're in a creative job where you're constantly solving new problems, those are kind of the same thing, then IQ, as the complexity of the job increases, the predictive utility of IQ increases, which is only to say that smarter people can handle complex situations faster. It's like, that doesn't seem like a particularly radical claim. And by the time the Soviet Revolution came around, which would be at the latter part of the 1910s, after the First World War, the peasant class had actually established farms, of course, varying productivity. Some of the peasant farmers were very, very good at being farmers and produced a huge proportion of Russia's and Ukraine's food. It's one of the things that you'll find if you look at creative production in any domain, it doesn't matter, where the fundamental underlying measure is human productivity, what you find is that a very tiny percentage of people produce almost all the output. And it was studied in detail in scientific productivity by someone named de Sola Price. It's a square root law, so here's the law fundamentally. If you look at the number of people who are in a given domain, who are producing in a given domain, the square root of the people produce half the product. So that means if you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work, but if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them do half the work. Right? It's a very, very vicious statistic. And you won't learn about that in psychology for reasons I have no idea about, because you learn about the normal distribution and not the Pareto distribution. But Pareto distributions govern, for example, the distribution of money, which is why 1% of the people in the general population have the overwhelming amount of money, and 1/10 of that 1% has almost all of that, right? So I think it's like the richest 100 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. And you think, well, that's a terrible thing, and perhaps it is, but what you have to understand is that that law governs the distribution of creative production across all creative domains, right? It's something like a natural law, and we'll talk about that more, but imagine what happens when you play Monopoly. You've all played Monopoly. What happens when you play Monopoly? One person ends up with all the money, all right? Then you play another game of Monopoly. What happens? One person ends up with all the money. It's actually the inevitable consequence of multiple trades that are conducted randomly. So if you take 1,000 people and you get them to play a trading game, you each give them $100, say, or $10, and they have to trade with another person by flipping a coin. I win the coin toss, you give me $1, you win, I give you $1. If we all play that long enough, one person will end up with all the money and everyone else will end up with 0. So it's a deeply built feature of systems of creative production, and no one really knows what to do about it, because of course the danger is that all the resources get funneled to a tiny minority of people at the top, and a huge section of the population stacks up at 0. But to blame that on the oppressive nature of a given system is to radically underestimate the complexity of the problem. No one actually knows how to effectively shovel resources from the minority that controls almost everything to the majority that has almost nothing in any consistent way, because as you shovel money down, it tends to move right back up, and it's a big problem. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you about that is because after the peasants were granted their land and started to become farmers, a tiny minority of them became extremely successful, and those people produced almost all of the food for Russia and Ukraine. So what happened in the 1920s when bloody Lenin came along and collectivized the farms was that they defined the kulaks, who were these tiny minority of successful farmers who maybe had a brick house and were able to hire a couple of people and had some land and some livestock and were very productive people. They defined them as socially unfriendly elements, and they sent groups of intellectuals out into the towns to collectivize the farms. And so the idea was that, well, you would pool your land and everyone would farm it collectively, and the land was taken away, of course, from the tiny minority of people who were actually productive and had actually managed to own much of the land. So you have to imagine how that would occur. Okay, so it's in the 1920s, it's after World War I, Russia's in pretty bad shape, the villages are full of brutalized men who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and lots of people who are not doing well at all, and the bloody intellectuals come into the town and they say, you know those successful farmers up the street that you've always been pretty jealous about in your useless manner? Well, they're actually pigs and demons who are stealing from you, so why don't you come out, we'll form a nice little mob and we'll take everything they've got. And that's exactly what happened, and all those people were killed or raped or set off to Siberia in the middle of the bloody winter where there wasn't even anything for them to to anywhere for them to live or anything for them to eat, so they all died. And then the consequence of that was a few years later, 6 million people starved to death in the Ukraine. So I'll just run this simulation for you, okay? And this shows you why the Pareto distribution emerges. Now you have to watch this quickly because it's a fairly fast animation. So here's what happens. Everybody starts out with $10. There's 1,000 people playing the game. Everybody starts out with $10. I have $1, you have $1. I flip a coin. If I get heads, you give me $1. If I get tails, I give you $1. We go around and we trade with everyone. Okay, so the first thing that happens when people start to trade is this. Normal distribution develops, right? Because some people lose and some people win. It's just like the Galton board that I showed you. Okay, so you keep playing. People start to stack up at 0. Watch. Because they lose 10 times in a row. Bang, they're done. The bottom graph is a graph of the entropy of the distribution, which increases as the game continues. Because at the beginning, it's maximally ordered, right? Everybody has exactly the same amount. Now it's being distributed. Same equations apply to the distribution of gas into a vacuum. Well, what happens? Now someone, you know, there are people out there at the $50 range or at the $60 range, or at the $70 range. You keep playing it. Well, eventually what happens if you play it right to its conclusion is that one person ends up with all the money. So that's, to those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. That's the law of economic productivity. It's called it's the Matthew principle, and it's actually an economic principle that was derived from a saying in the New Testament.